Welcome, Noel.
Hey JG, how are you this morning? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, hey.
Yeah, how are you this morning?
Doing all right, man. How you doing?
Doing well. Anyway, I was on what's his face's Aces earlier this morning, and I was listening to his little essay thingy that he writes. And there's actually I think I found one common ground is that it's weird. It's like he says that um people only focus on the good but they don't focus on the bad, right? And you should ignore the bad because God's going to take care of that in due time. And I'm wondering, like, when he says stuff like that, if it's equivalent to God working in us to keep us away from the evil and stuff like that. But it was interesting because there was a point made there that from death to life, right? And how are we to move from death to life? Like, I was thinking about it because when are we alive when we're all sentenced to death, right? Because of Adam and Eve, we're all transgressed and all humans are sentenced to death. So no human is considered alive in God's eyes, right? So if God is resurrecting us when we die and we're not alive in Christ, as Christ was alive in himself, right, living and breathing, then how are we to be resurrected? Like from what life are we to be resurrected from, right? What mortality to immortality if we never put on the immortality that was supposed to be only in Jesus and in Christ, right? So like, yeah, because you can't resurrect something that's dead, right? You if it's dead and it becomes alive, then it never had mortality. So at which some point we get some type of mortality when we accept Christ, and then Christ resurrects that newness of us. And I think that goes into 1 Corinthians 15, 45 to like 55. I try to sum it up with him. But yeah, he didn't really comment on it. He just did his usual yep, so
You
hopefully he'll
said
consider it later.
you said accept Christ, so that's going to be an obviously different position than he has, right?
Yeah, I was hoping he'd kind of challenge that because if everyone's getting resurrected, and I told him it challenges his whole. It's a challenge to not like I'm directly challenging it, but it questions it just because of the implications. Like the whole, can a fellow know that he's saved if if he doesn't know? Well, eventually, then yeah, he will be saved. But if he never comes into that recognition, and Christ never knew him, what's there to resurrect? I didn't get to suss it out that far, but really, it's concerning because even if you do go with determinism, like that spooks me up because that means you were never alive, right? You just seem like some vessel of destruction, a walking corpse.
But what happens when you go with determinism and you're engaging with someone? You got Ace Theo, who's a full determinist, engaging with you. Why would you skip past the full determinism and engage with him?
Well,
Why
I
would
do.
you
I
get that out?
I think I did like that was one of the first things I did. Actually, I called out because he was calling out people self righteous, right? I'm like, well, how can you call out if God is in everybody doing everything? Then it's God being self righteous to self. It's no one. There is no character of I. Right? I didn't explain this far. I said like so when everyone's focusing on their own self importance, then it's God focusing on Himself because there is no I to be claimed there. If we're all puppets of God. So being dead or alive through suffering, we're still it's still a part of God because Christ was he is the immortality, but even he lived suffered on the cross, right? He wasn't a glamorous life by any means.
Well, if you think that he has a worldview that's illusory, how are you going to just walk past that with him or grant that to him? What happens then if your argument is ultimately that your interlocutor can't even argue because he's painted himself into an illusion? How are you going to just skip past that and not be in folly yourself by granting him that
Oh,
position?
at that point, it's not. The illusion is both given by God for us to, like, I have. It literally just has to go down to that. Like, you have to play along with the rules in a hard deterministic view. Like you're just as much as a meat puppet as he is. And so, as much as we think we're doing these things, it's really not us. And
So what happens then in the argument? Because you're in there persuading someone, he's in there trying to persuade you, which is naturally an ought or a should embedded into the conversation, right? When you're trying to persuade somebody.
I think so.
Yeah, it is. So what
And it
happens
convinces,
there?
yeah, because you have to.
You're granting him the ability to know the correct way of thinking about these matters when you've already saying he can't even do that.
Well, it's already established because it has to be granted. For
No,
an example, no. Let me
no, it
give you an
doesn't.
example.
It
Let me
doesn't
give
have
you an
to be
example. What I
granted.
mean. Let me give you an example of what it's in tangent to necessary being. So what I mean by that is because God is unchanging, right? And he was uncreated, and God cannot be created, because if he could be, then he wouldn't be a God. Like if he ever was at some point non-created, right? And that's what I mean. There's never a point in which God was never uncreated. So that's a hard deterministic thing. Like you can't change those things about God. Even in the granted that we have free will, like the things about God are just set in stone. I take it as brute fact because God's unchanging, whether that be static in his ability to create or his ability to cognate, like think of things, and if you even qualify it as thinking, since he already knows everything.
I'm sorry. This answers why you allow someone who's saying that they have no control and no will, that they're fully directed without responsibility. This grants them into a meaningful conversation with you. How?
I grant that there's a hard deterministic value to God that shouldn't be ignored, and from their perspective, God is in control of everyone, and to a certain degree, that is the case through the Holy Spirit. Now, that doesn't mean God runs our every thoughts, and that's where we disagree.
Right. That's a huge difference right there at the end.
Yeah,
He's saying that God is running his thoughts. He can't make a distinction between himself and God. These matters make me think of a welcome, Jamie, by the way. These matters make me think of, on the screen there, Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you yourself will be just like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. So those two suggestions are key when you're dealing with people who are coming at you with a theory that's saying, well, I have no responsibility. God's doing everything. How are they going to point the finger at you? How are they going to be right? How are you going to be wrong if they're pointing everything to God? How are they making a distinction of you and me? They can't get past this. They don't even understand this for some reason.
I think they look at it from a works perspective. It's interesting because you never hear him quote things that will back up that. For example, like answering people to their sins and why. And you even have it where I forget where it's at, but where he's talking about. I think it's Peter telling the Christ, "How many times do you forgive a brother if he comes at you?" And he says, "The 70 times 70, you forgive him," which shows that there's going to be times where it's not going to be good times, so to speak, but you should still forgive your brother for each 70th up to the 70th transgression, right?
Yeah, what are you getting at with the forgiveness? Granting?
Potential. Yeah.
No, see, but that's not. If you see an error in your brother's way, this is not a matter of forgiveness. This is a matter of reproof. You say, you can't step forward with it while holding this idea. It doesn't work for you to make distinctions when you're saying everything you do is not your responsibility and God's doing it. He's He's stopping himself from having any coherency or unity or unifying factor in his worldview. He's trying to claim it's God, but he can't make the distinction of self and will and responsibility. He's ignoring that. He's throwing that out. You see this behavior in the way he throws out scriptures and changes them as well. The behavior of his fundamental position goes into everything that he comes up with. He calls it freedom, but he tries to be bound by no moral or ethical framework, and then tries to point out how you're wrong and you're evil and blah, blah, blah. You want to stay with him before he can get into that because he's stuck here. I don't think granting is forgiveness or charity. I think it's folly at that level.
I see what you're saying. And I see how in your perspective how free will in that aspect cures that. I see it more as if you're gonna take a log out of your neighbor's eye, make sure you have the log removed from your own eye. And I just don't think I had the log removed from my own eye in that hard
It's because you
deterministic
don't have
question.
you don't have a strong fundamental position, as I've told you before. Like you're not really coming in with an actual position, or can you plainly state your position if you do?
Well, it's really it's yeah. I mean, above all, whether there's hard deterministic or not, um, God is it goes in within the Omni properties. Like that doesn't change the outcome of either of yeah, either decision. The foundation is within God's a self knowledge and awareness and existence.
Can you hear me now?
Whether I have it right or wrong doesn't play a sway on God's existence. Go ahead. Sorry.
Whether you
Sorry,
have it right or wrong has a sway
I
on
think,
what you're bringing forward. Go ahead, Jay.
oh, I think Tog, you must be a Thomist, right?
I don't know the names. No,
Thomas
I don't.
Thomas Aquinas. Are you
No, I
Catholic?
never
I
studied.
forget.
I
Doesn't-
was raised Catholic. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm not a practicing Catholic. I guess if you want to say that, right?
Okay. You sound like someone who's taught by somebody who, and Thomas Aquinas is obviously a great theologian. He was like, you sound like a Thomist. I'll just say it that way. It doesn't matter. I'm not saying you're right or wrong or anything. I'm just saying
Well, thank you. I
Thomism
guess.
is a great foundation for he wasn't a Calvinist, but he was very strong on sort of God determining things, and so
I tend to take. I'm trying to develop a position. Actually, it goes into JG's foundation that's called static free will, and it's really important because static also means it's unchanging. So how can you have an unchanging free will, which again already seems to be the case because God has determined it? It's just a hard way of explaining that because I'm not educatedly sound enough to
well,
parse it out in language.
I think going too far in either direction is wrong, and so obviously if you just read the narrative of Scripture, not taking individual text to prove a point, but if you just read like what does the Bible show and what's going on in the world, and I would say is what's really clear if you kind of are familiar with the narrative of what happens from Genesis, how God's working. He's constantly dealing with people not doing what he wants and asks them to do. And then but he's faithful and coming through. And so what is it that God's determining? Well, he's determined to get people to come to him, but he doesn't. It's so obvious that they can, should, and don't, and he's merciful and long suffering. Words like that. So it's like I don't see how people would try to reinterpret that like overarching narrative of the Bible, which is like the story of salvation, that God is patient, long suffering with humans, and like implementing and interacting to win people over. So to me, the idea that people couldn't do otherwise is absurd when you look at the narrative of the Bible.
Yeah, it
And
seems to be all about behavior and our interaction moving toward away from God, right?
Yeah, that's why I made a video the other day where I was just like, there's a really kind of like, look, I don't think you are saved by being obedient. I don't think that's how that works. But when people there's like this famous quote that everybody loves where he's like, the gospel isn't about making bad people good. It's about making dead people alive. And it's like, that's not wrong. But like, it's like when people say repentance has nothing to do with turning from sin. And I'm like, yeah, uh, it's like saying, jumping into water, a pool full of water isn't about getting wet, because when you're jumping, you're not wet yet. You know what I
Well,
mean?
yeah, it's a sort of a false comparison. He wants you to focus on the latter thing he's saying as though it's more important, but they're still both relevant, right?
Yeah, they're intrinsically tied together for the purpose of an end, which is to make bad people good eventually, right? Like think about a
Yeah.
broader view of Christianity in history. Is it made the world a better place, even though people still sin? And back to with the ace thing, it's like, uh, you know, he was clearly, if you know the history of the Plymouth Brethren, they're radical sort of free grace, and with their way they use their eschatology, it's like not surprising. He has a disdain. He leaves comments on my thing all the time. Oh, you must be so proud of yourself. It's like, no, look, I recognize I'm a sinner in need of a savior. It's just like Christians never had that sort of attitude that a lot of people exude. Like, it says, let your good works, do your good works before men, so they'll honor the Father in heaven. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works. Like, no one quotes that verse anymore. Like, right?
Yeah.
So like, instead of, nobody cares about about character as much as they do about saying that that's self-righteous. And I just don't see that anywhere in the text talking that way. No one ever condemns anyone in the New Testament for doing the righteous works of God that, Ephesians 4 says that we're saved by grace through faith so that unto good works. It's like, but people don't have that attitude. They just think anybody who's for, I don't know, at least within the church at large, I think it's just a totally, obviously you can get caught up in being self-righteous. Don't get me wrong. I just mean, like, it's good to do good things. People are so caught up on the first part, they don't want to talk about the rest. And so he's found a way to try to like cling to his universalism thing. We've been talking to him for so long, JG. I don't do it anymore. It's just so tiring.
Oh yeah, I mean you're better off. I don't see you over there often, so I say, well, that guy's smarter than me in that respect.
Yeah, like I don't see a point because they're stuck in their ways, right? You're not going to convince a determinist, right? They're already predetermined. They're already set out. They're biased, and if you can't come at them with inside that frame view, you're not. Which I think is important because he's always asking, "Have you taken in?" So maybe if you take it in and then reject it, what are you going to do? Okay, I took it in, I accepted it, but then I reject it. Am I still saved if I go to preach eternal hellfire? Of course, right? How is he going to say no? So what is he going to say? Like when the eternal hellfire person says, "Okay, I accept universalism. I'm saved," and now I'm going to go back to preaching eternal hellfire because I'm still saved. And
Yeah,
it's
you
not
can
based
kind of
on my behavior,
do that
right?
with anybody who thinks you can't lose your salvation or everybody's saved, because it's like that's the first comment I ever made to Ace Theo. I came across his channel and I listened to his video and I was like, and I said in the comment, I hadn't talked to him before. I was like, why even preach? Because if you're wrong, then you're actually the worst kind of opposition to the Great Commission. But if you are right, there's no point in saying anything because everybody's saved anyway.
Right,
So like,
he's pulling the wind out of his own sails to be able to make these arguments.
yeah, he's really just, if he's wrong, he's just literally fighting. I mean, I get accused of that too because I'm always pushing back on the historic majority Christian doctrines because I think some of them are wrong. But
So
he's saying things nothing matters ultimately.
Yeah, it's nihilism, but they have a focal point of God. It's a strange combination.
I was going to go into like John 10:18 because I think it's a stumper for them because it goes I'll just read it off. It says, "No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father," right? And um by accord, in some translations, it's talking about his free will. Like, by my own free will, I do this. I have been given this by the Father. So there's still like that essence of obedience, but I'm choosing to obey.
Yeah.
And like that's like a something that like choosing to obey is like learning your ABCs, right? And it should be a natural process, although it sounds silly because naturalistically we don't need the alphabet. It's only a societal thing.
And they don't think Jesus, like traditionally that verse wouldn't work very good because it's Jesus talking about himself. And most Christians would be like, well, Jesus is God and God can't sin. And you get into that whole thing. But of course, they don't believe Jesus is eternal, those guys. So Jesus is a human to them, merely a human. And so that verse is particularly powerful against a deterministic view there. I would point to one of the most obvious ones to me is 1 Corinthians 10:13. It's like, let's see, it's no temptation is overtaking you than that which is common to man. God offers a way of escape so that you may be able to bear it. Something like that. It's like, if that isn't multiple options are possible, I don't know what would be. He's basically saying like everybody's tempted, but God is faithful and offers a way of escape so that you can bear the temptation. Yeah, there you go.
Right. And
Not
like
suffering.
that's a
Think about
like
that.
how in a hard deterministic world, what does then temptation even mean? Because there's no I to be tempted, right? You're not making a
Yeah.
choice.
Well,
So
see,
it's like an illusionary word that we create, and it doesn't even make sense because then is that the strong delusion that God builds us in, that we have the emotional impact is the temptation, but it's not.
I think the
temptation?
strong delusion is God giving people over to the lie that they love so that they might be judged. That's a good verse to talk about.
Yes, I would agree with that too. Yeah, that's like an effect of God's law. Ultimately, that's the consequence.
The man of sin. It's the people following the Antichrist.
We see that Romans 1, right? Like they worship the creature more than the creator, so he turns them over to their ways.
Yeah, right. But I would say, so if you're talking to Calvinists, they believe in choice. They just think the choice is determined. So choice, but obviously if you're not a determinist or a hard determinist, you're going to think about it differently than them, but they'll just kind of scoff you off talking about choice because they obviously know the word choice is all over the Bible. But this is what's particularly powerful about this verse. But I agree with you. The temptation thing seems purposeless if God's determined every outcome of every circumstance. But what's powerful about this verse is that the last line, in other words, this verse is clearly saying it could go either way. And often God always, if you're a believer, God has makes a way of escape, but we don't always take it. And so when you don't take it, you could have taken it, but sometimes we don't. And so that's multiple possibility. That's a counter-causal free will, if you will.
Yeah, that's a good point. I want to, I want to take these ideas and take them back to where they start, because if they're going to claim a fully determined world, it makes more sense than going through the entire scriptures with them saying, how do you make that work from the start? Which points out how they strip responsibility for their own interpretation and argument before you even get into that. I find that more powerful and meaningful than saying, oh, well, okay, you say it's the term, let's go into the scriptures. And I'll just listen to every take you have on the scriptures. I don't think it works from the get-go. I don't think they can get off the ground, so I would stay there with them.
You mean philosophically or from the...
Well, yeah, because everyone's going to bring the worldview into the scriptures. Right? It's inescapable. So if you have a philosophy that says, well, I make no choices, I have no responsibility, let me argue with you about your choices and your responsibility. It's like, wait a second. How's that going to work?
Yeah.
Welcome, Smokey. How you doing, man?
Oh, is that the real Smokey or a fake Smokey?
No, it's me. It is me.
Hey,
Keep going.
I was gonna say
Jamie,
this
you
gets
keep
into-
messaging me. You keep messaging me on Facebook, but you have me blocked, so I can't respond. I don't know if you know.
I didn't block you on Facebook.
Well, I can't respond to you. I don't know why. Something's messed up with Messenger. It does not let me respond to you.
Oh, okay. I'll see what I can.
Yeah, you might double check that, man. I think you have me blocked in there or something.
Okay. I wondered what the hell. Here comes the real Thomist here.
You
Well,
guys
no,
talking-
I'm
I
not a
heard you talking about
Thomist. I just
Calvinism.
studied under one. That's not accurate.
Wait, no, you two know. I mean, another guy came in who's a Thomist. That I
Oh,
Oh,
know.
okay.
really? That's interesting. But yeah, I mean, so when it comes to predestination, because I heard people were talking about predestination and Calvinism. One of the distinctions between the Thomistic and Calvinistic view, because Calvinists, John Calvin and St. Thomas Aquinas both have very kind of strict views of predestination. But I think St. Thomas kind of emphasizes free will a lot more. His idea is essentially active and permissive will, which is basically the idea that God has he has an active will that all men be saved. But like a judge, when you think of a judge who wills for all of his citizens to, live happy lives and live good moral lives, but ultimately knows that he's going to have to use his power to allow some to be imprisoned and to be punished. St. Thomas would say, in the same measure, God being a good judge understands that wishes for all of his creatures to hypothetically receive the grace to ultimately participate in the supreme good, but he also realizes that it is best for the sake of his creatures that they ultimately are offered grace unmeritoriously but accept it freely, which is ultimately why he explains some go to heaven and some go to hell. Now, both St. Thomas and Calvin do come to the conclusion that God does pick and choose who is saved. But the way St. Thomas basically describes it is God does this by making grace more appealing to some who he elects and making it less appealing to those who he doesn't elect. So the call of grace is still available to all men, but the way it's received is different. So someone who, I guess, for whatever reason, for the sake of God's providence, ultimately God has determined, if God has determined somebody for the sake of his providence, it would be best for that person to be saved. He'll make grace more appealing to that person. But if for whatever reason he's determined that for the sake of his providence, it isn't right for another person to receive that same grace, he'll make grace less appealing. So ultimately that preserves free will in his mind, because that ultimately says, all right, yes, God is offering grace unmeritoriously, and God is, the sole cause of a person being saved. But if a person goes to, if a person isn't saved, it's ultimately their fault, because while God has not made grace as appealing, they're still ultimately, because of their own rational appetites, not cooperating with the grace that's been made available to all men. Because of that, it still preserves free will in that regard. And so that's kind of the difference between St. Thomas's mentality and Calvin's mentality. I think a good analogy would be, from a Calvinistic perspective, predestination would be, imagine a man who writes a book or writes a fictional book. We'll just say that for the sake of argument, he writes a fictional book, and the characters that he writes are, let's say they make bad choices. Ultimately, the author is the one deciding that that person makes bad choices, but ultimately ontologically, the character within the book is the one who's making the choices according to their own ontology. Whereas St. Thomas would compare it to, think of the sun. Like if you wanted to participate in the sunlight, you would go outside and you would ultimately be in a position where the sun is reflecting onto you. And if you wanted to grow in the amount of sunlight that you're receiving, you could ultimately spend more time in the sun or get to a position where you're receiving more of the sunlight shining down on you. But ultimately, you didn't choose the sun. You didn't choose that the sun was going to be out that day and you were going to participate in the sunlight. Ultimately, the sun was there before you could make the decision that you wanted to participate in the sunlight. So therefore, ultimately, the sun shining in the sky is the chief and only cause as to why you get to participate in the sunlight. However, if you block your hand, if you take your hand and you block the sunlight from ultimately shining on you, you are the one to blame for not having the sun shining down on you, because ultimately you're the one putting yourself in a position where you're not receiving the rays of sun shining down on you.
I personally found that to be a little bit messy, but the way you ended it, I kind of agree with. So I guess I don't know if I want to parse all the bits and pieces of that. I mean, are you still presenting the idea that Thomas Aquinas was salvifically monergistic? Like, are you holding that? I guess I got a little confused on your monologue there a little bit.
Well, I wouldn't say that he was a monergist by any means, but he's someone who tries to thread the needle between predeterminism and Pelagianism. So he stresses very, very, very much that we cannot earn the first grace to begin with. That's what
Well, yeah,
Pelagius
that's what
taught.
makes it monergistic. That's what I was talking about.
Right, but he also does stress the idea of participation. So he stresses the idea that that grace
The first mover of salvation is an Arminian idea, really, also a Molinist idea. But the Calvinist and the Thomist, as I've seen, generally tends to take it to a micro level.
right.
That like you can't even make that individual decision. Like an Armenian will say, well, it's open to all and you just have to accept it. But a Calvinist and a Thomist will say more, no, God's got to move on you first before you can accept it.
Right.
So like
right,
they
right.
still make him the primary mover, but they make him the primary mover at a micro level, at like the individual level, instead of the grand mover of all of salvation.
Right. And I think the difference between, say, Molinist predestination or Scotus predestination or Thomistic predestination mostly comes down to the motives as to why God predestined things certain ways. The Molinist would say, God saw all these different worlds and he saw all these different possibilities, and then he just kind of planned things according to that providence. A Scotist would
Well,
say
but a
that,
Molinist doesn't hold to a necessary reality.
right,
Like other than the structure of the grand reality, like reality with dynamic relational
right,
components or things like that. They don't go to the micro level. They don't be like, well, God chose this reality to be the reality that unfolds. That's not Molinism.
right. Someone like Blessed John Duns Scotus would say that God ultimately predestined uh, all of reality around the cross. That's basically the argument he makes. Is he basically addresses the? It's almost like what came first, the chicken or the egg. He basically says what came first in God's providence. Did man sinning come first, and then Jesus had to come because of that, or did
Well, but
or what, or
okay,
was
no,
it?
I'm sorry. Go ahead and finish.
Yeah, but like someone like Blessed John Duns Scotus would say, what came first? Was it the chicken or the egg? Was it sin came into the world first, and then Jesus had to come because it was necessary to redeem man of sin? Or was it that man was ultimately allowed to sin because Jesus redeeming the world was ultimately the best possible consequence for mankind? And what Blessed John says is, he says, it's the latter. He says ultimately that God allowed mankind to fall into sin because the best possible outcome was for Jesus to redeem all of humanity, which St. Thomas would disagree with. St. Thomas says,
Well, no, he would disagree. He would say the optimum reality would be the reality where man never fell.
right, exactly.
And once man fell, you had a minimalization of the scope of possible realities to now only include ones where either mankind was judged and destroyed or redeemed.
Right.
So now you have a decrease. You have a continual decrease in scope of possible realities from the first motion.
Right.
So the first motion, the Big Bang, everything that occurs after that in its own dynamic decreases the scope of allowable possible realities. While at the beginning, basically all possible realities are possible. But as things move down and the decisions of the agents filter through, the scope of possible realities for them minimalizes. It's like if I go commit murder and I'm caught and prosecuted, well, now all my scope of possible realities are along the lines of what I do in prison,
Right.
Instead of what I do in the whole world. Just like for the fall of man, once man fell, all the scope of possible realities now fell within the scope of what happens after man falls. There's no possible reality after that where man doesn't fall.
Right.
But that's again, this is temporal logic. This isn't like, this is sometimes it gets muddled between, temporal logic and non-temporal logic, like the viewpoint of God with the viewpoint of man, and it sometimes gets muddled in the philosophy. Anyway. It's an interesting conversation. I love the Thomas Molinist conversations. Those are always really interesting to me.
It is
I'm a
very
Molinist.
interesting.
I'm a Molinist, by the way, but I studied under a Thomist, so I'm fairly familiar with both.
Okay. If you don't mind me asking, are you in the Catholic Church, or are you a different sect?
I'm not. I would know. My teacher was a non-Catholic Thomist, so.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, it's very interesting because, obviously I would say most Thomists are Catholic, but it's interesting that there are a decent amount of Thomists.
Well, I'm a Molinist, but I'm also not a Jesuit, so
right. Well, there's
not necessarily connected,
Yeah. Well, I know back in the day, when Father Luis de Molina was around, the Dominicans, now he lived, well after St. Thomas. He lived hundreds of years after St. Thomas. But Father Luis de Molina, the Dominican order, which was St. Thomas Aquinas's religious order, tried to get Father de Molina excommunicated from the church because they didn't agree with that view of predestination. And the person who defended Father de Molina in his excommunication trial was Saint Robert Bellarmine, who was another Jesuit, and he was mostly well known for the Counter-Reformation. But Saint Robert's basic main argument was Saint Robert was basically a Thomist on predestination. But he was like, he's a Jesuit, so I'm gonna defend him. And he basically said that he didn't agree with Father de Molina on predestination, but because he was a fellow Jesuit, he supported him, and he was able to get Father de Molina not excommunicated. He was able to convince the Pope not to excommunicate Father de Molina from the church.
I had a lot of extensive conversations about Molina versus Aquinas. And really, many times it seems like they almost end up getting to the same place. They just start at opposite ends of the, free will dynamic spectrum is really what it tends to look like. And really at that point, the differences become minutia, in some ways. So I don't usually pick the fight. Thomism versus Molinism, it always ends the same way. You all just end up getting to a center point that you end up agree with anyway. You just kind of you have disagreements with primary methodologies at the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't, obviously as a Thomist, I would say, while I would consider myself a Thomist first and foremost, I wouldn't say like I'm someone who is just going to hate on every single person that has a contrary view to Thomism. Like, I respect people like Father De Molina, and I respect Blessed John Duns Scotus, even though they have views that I think, in some cases might be a little bit contrary to St. Thomas. And I respect people like Patriarch Gregory Palamas, even though, again,
One
there's
of my
probably
main reasons for appreciating Molinism as much as I do is because it extends so much further beyond salvific determinism. It deals with an entire broad scoping philosophy of God's relationship with reality, where Calvinism assumes things
Mhm.
or simply asserts things. Molinism really does try, in my view, to actually really unpack it all. Where Calvinism tends to just make assertions about determination and predestination without really too many solid arguments to the defense of it, while Molinism is much more, to me, intensive and
Yeah.
far-reaching.
Yeah.
I tend to find that Calvinism and some of these other viewpoints are so strictly about the salvific methodology rather than fatalistic
Yeah.
views or meticulous causal determinism or stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, there's a
And
belief
that's
that,
why I think they stumble into it. I think that's why the Calvinists always stumble into it, because there's not much in there to deal or rectify with those views. So they all end up kind of just following it through to its critical logic, to where then you end up adopting some form of meticulous determinism, unless you're
right.
a full-blown compatibilist, and we can argue whether that even makes sense at all. But yeah, that's
Right.
generally where it seems to go.
Yeah.
I think
Um,
compatibilism is just determinism with one extra step. You know what I mean?
yeah. Yeah, and the thing is, like, there's a belief that like Saint Augustine was a Calvinist, or he was a proto-Calvinist, which I don't agree with. I think if you read a lot of Saint Augustine's work, it definitely seems like he was more
I do think
aligned.
Augustine was monergist. I do believe that.
You think he was?
Yeah, I kind of do. I kind of think he is actually the godfather of a lot of the modern monergism. You
I'm
know,
not sure I really agree with that, because if you read a lot of his writings, he does emphasize that God, he has a famous quote where he says, God does not save us without us. So he definitely stresses active and permissive will, which is something that is not, extremely popular in Calvinist circles.
well, yeah, but I'm talking. Yeah, no, I'm not talking about the meticulous determinist side of it, though. I'm just talking about the overall monergist principle, that basically total depravity. Like, you can't do anything or come to salvation without God moving upon you. I'm
Yeah.
because, and by the way, that's where it all comes down to. We can forget all the uninteresting argument really is all the fatalistic stuff and things like that. If you're a fatalist, I think you're just nuts. But the real boiling down point of it is, does regeneration precede faith, or does faith precede regeneration? That's true monergism at its heart to me.
Right.
Like, you forget about the fatalistic or the meticulous causation or anything like that. To me, it boils down to, is God the grand mover or the individual first mover for each person? That's where I think a lot of the disagreement really is housed, and people avoid that primary disagreement by talking about fatalism and meticulous determinism and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, and I know, when it comes to St. Thomas, I mean, St. Thomas does come to the argument that, nobody can fulfill a good work without God.
Right. That's where it's kind of enshrined and housed, and that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking
Right.
about and that's where the disagreement is after the fact, because then you're talking about, well, is sanctification a product of free will, or is God irrevocably and unavoidably moving upon you to make you do different things, to make you sanctified? Like, do you have free will to allow sanctification, or are you out of control and God's just doing it all for you? And this
Yeah.
is again where synergy and monergy kind of clash.
Well, I know what St. Thomas basically argues is he basically argues that God is the supreme good. He is the intellect of all good. Obviously, he's taking from divine simplicity, which is basically the idea that all men have a natural end to do good, which is why when a person fails to do something good, they inherently feel unsatisfied. He would say, from the standpoint of teleology, he would say that's because a person is deprived of the means to achieve their natural end. However, what he would say is like he would say, like, let's say an atheist, for example, helps an old lady walk across the street. St. Thomas would say there's obviously a detection of good there, but he would say that the act of good is never fully fulfilled because the atheist does not recognize ultimately the source of the good that he's doing, which is ultimately God himself. So that's kind of where he comes from with the idea that all good comes from God. But in regards to your argument about sanctification, what he basically argues is he basically argues for this thing called cooperative grace, which is basically the idea that ultimately, God is, the primary principal causer of grace. But at the same time, man has been endowed with a rational appetite, which allows him to ultimately interact with God's grace and ultimately
That's
cooperate with.
anti-Calvinist. That's
Right,
anti-Calvinist.
that's anti-Calvinist, but that's something that St. Thomas absolutely presses down on the he absolutely presses down on the pedals on that. That's something he's very, very, very supportive of, and that's also where he gets into the
So you
treasury of
do
man.
adopt both divine simplicity and purus actus. Then you're full blown with it.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
I'm
all right,
somebody
okay.
who's a divine simplicity person. I know Father Cornelio Fabro. I don't know if you studied any of Father Cornelio Fabro, but he was a Dominican Thomist in the 20th century, very recently, and he writes specifically about the topic of participation. Like, he's from the order that St. Thomas was a part of, but he only writes about the doctrine of participation, which I think is central to understanding St. Thomas's view on predestination. Is understanding his view of participation, and Father Fabro only talks about that. A lot of other people who are kind of like neo-Thomists, like Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, they'll try to kind of take all the things that St. Thomas talked about, and they'll kind of try to harmonize it with the modern world and the modern views of the Catholic Church. But somebody like Father Fabro is unique in the sense that he only focuses on participation, because he basically believed that all of Thomistic thought surrounded the view of participation, and participating in God, and he thought that was the heart of St. Thomas's philosophy, which is why he only ever focuses on that in his writings.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So which version of purus actus do you hold to? Is it the one where God is all action, but only at the beginning of time, and then when it's delineated, or is he the purus actus that everything in existence is a byproduct of his action, and every micro thing is a product of his action?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I haven't studied all the different
That's
all of
fine.
those.
I was just curious if you had a stance on
Yeah,
that yet
I
or
mean,
not.
I've studied St. Thomas's view of divine simplicity very, 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 very closely. I've studied the First Way very, very, very closely, and I would say, the view. I really don't see any issues with his view on the First Way. Now, in terms of delineating views of how that's how, over the years from neo-Thomists on how, divine simplicity may delineate. I'll be honest with you, I haven't studied that extremely well, so I can't really give you an answer. But what I can tell you is, based on what I've read, based on St. Thomas's view of the first way and his view of divine simplicity there, that's something that I don't see really any problem with, and it's something that I would say I completely concur with.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Interesting. Yeah,
I think
I've
Jamie
kind of,
left the chat.
yeah, he did. Yeah, he took off. Yeah. He doesn't usually like sticking around with me too long in a room. Says he makes him feel dirty.
Yeah, he's a good guy, but we do disagree over eternal conscious torment.
Yeah, well, take a number. You know? Jamie and I did a debate a while ago, years ago, on Praise's channel about the consequence or expectation of the law for the believer and stuff like that. And his
Yeah.
SDA stuff is really, he's really stepped down on it too. Like his posts about, anyone that serves a God that believes in eternal conscious torment is serving an evil God. He's really stepped it up to the, umpteenth power. He wasn't really that level with it last I talked to him, but recently he's gotten real,
Yeah.
kind of like the way that they'll condemn many Calvinists is, that happen to be fatalists, saying your God is evil because he made evil happen, and he's kind of doing the same thing of like, well, if your God would torture someone for eternity, he must be a demon, that kind of thing.
Right. Well, that's one of the things that, that's another thing. I had a debate with him, kind of a small debate on his birthday chat, because it was basically an open panel for his birthday, and he was like, well, I wouldn't usually bring this up out of charitability, but I'm going to bring this up because it's my birthday and I can do what I want. And he basically was like, oh, so Easter Thomas, what do you think about eternal conscious torment? And I made the Thomistic argument. I was like, the idea, a person's dignity is, in the large part based on their end. And if a person, if a reprobate's end is ultimately, according to God's providence, is ultimately just to be annihilated, then that ultimately destroys the dignity of that reprobate person in general. Whereas if a person is in hell eternally, then yes, that's unfortunate. Yes, it's unfortunate that that person is suffering, but that person still maintains dignity in as much as they continue to participate in God's order. Kind of like a prisoner in a prison cell, a criminal in a prison cell is still participating in a society. They're participating in an unfortunate and most likely unpleasant way, but they're still participating in a way which is befitting to the actions that they've committed, and the harm that they've caused to society. And they're still getting their just deserts, and that still preserves the order of their action.
Well,
And
I argued with both CJ Cox and Jamie Russell on annihilationism many times in the past.
yeah,
And I had a pretty solid way, a couple different ways, to talk about how their view is quintessentially unnecessary, if not completely flawed in its logic. And one of the first things I would say is that there is no sin common to man that does not have eternal consequences. So like, and I'll give you a broad example of one to kind of where you get an idea, where like I take someone like Matt Dillahunty, right?
Yeah.
Who has led so many people away from the faith. Now, those people that were led away from the faith and justified by him are going to burn. And let's just go and give it to him. Let's just say the people that Dillahunty converted are annihilated, right?
Yeah.
Well, now those people are removed from the spectrum of the equation for all of eternity.
Right.
So there is an eternal consequence for their removal from the faith and Dillahunty's participation in it. So how can Dillahunty not deserve an eternal punishment? Because the consequences of that go on ad infinitum. So like all the things that those people would have done in service to God throughout all of eternity are now erased. So how can you possibly pay that debt with instantaneous annihilation? It doesn't add up. One would believe that you would have to face an eternal state of affairs because you've created an eternal state of affairs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other one is the asymptote argument. I really busted CJ's brain with that one. To where, like, are you familiar with the mathematical asymptote? You know, kind of where you have a curve and the curve gets ever closer to the x-axis but never touches it.
Yeah.
You know, so like I was presenting it in a curve where, like, you go to the first point of judgment, and that's your, you know, that's your initial state of judgment and hellfire and whatever it's going to be. And as time goes on, you get closer and closer to the line of destruction, but you never actually get there.
Yeah.
So you're less and less mind, you're less and less of your essence. You're basically in a state of constant destruction, but you never get to the final termination point of destruction.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway,
Well,
yeah.
although to be fair for Dillhunty, and while I'm sure he doesn't intend this, I think given how weak his apologetics are, I think he's also probably brought a lot of people to the faith as well, as much as he probably hates it.
Yeah. Well,
I mean,
yeah, I mean, well, you know, God can use anyone, even evil people. You know, that's,
right.
you know, and Dillahunty isn't known for really great arguments. I think if
Oh,
you're
yeah.
if you're a true, truthful, objective thinker looking for truth, you're going to notice that Dillahunty's full of it. You know what I mean?
Right. But I also think that if somebody is
But
skeptical about
Dillahunty's a
God,
mentalist. He's a mentalist. He's literally trained to be able to pull psychological tricks to you know, pull
right.
inception on people and make them think things he wants, and
Right.
you know, I
Well,
mean, he's a
that's the basis
mentalist.
of
Like, he
Sophism.
knows, he's basically taken his mentalist shtick and used it to essentially, you know, take over the minds of a whole group of very weak-minded people.
Right. Well, that's the point. That's the whole point of sophistries. Is the idea of a sophistry is, okay, we're not trying to discuss to deliberate the truth.
No, it's just infinite
I want to win the
denialism.
argument. I
It's
want to
just
come
an
out on
infinite
top.
denialism and infinite moving the goalpost.
Right, exactly. And he's somebody who I think, you know, watching some of his debates, I think he's someone who ultimately is more concerned with coming out on top and looking like, I own the dumb Christian guy, than he is someone who is, like, legitimately, like, I mean, you know, if you look at somebody like Alex O'Connor, I mean, give him credit. He does seem like someone who at least
I debated him on veganism once.
well, he seems like someone who's at least curious about the truth. Maybe he's not, but he definitely comes off
Yeah.
as someone who's more curious about the truth. Matt Dillhunty is not curious about the truth. He's
No.
somebody who just wants
No.
to come out. And
No,
say,
he's a
"I
grifter.
own the dumb
No, he's a
Christian."
full-blown grifter, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
What's your name again, man? What is your name?
Well, the handle I have on YouTube is Eastern Thomist.
Eastern Thomas. Okay, I'm Smokey.
Yeah.
You go over on A's Philosophies channel, right?
Oh yeah, I've been on there before.
Okay.
He's a good guy, but we have a lot of disagreement.
Yeah, I've had a discussion with him too. He seems like a good cat too.
Oh, was that Tog?
Yeah, hey,
Tog,
Smokey.
I didn't even know you were sitting here the whole time.
Yeah, I just been chilling. Came in to talk Ace Theo.
Interesting. Okay, well, I won't take any more time. I got a couple phone calls to make, so I'll dip out. But I'll catch up with you guys later. Nice chat. I enjoyed this one. This was interesting.
Yeah. Always good to
Yeah,
have a
thank you
chat.
for listening.
Yeah. Take care, guys.
Yep.
Talk to you
God
soon.
bless.
All right. So this started out as a Calvinist chat, I guess, with Jamie.
No, it was about Universalist.
Oh,
Yeah, Ace Theo.
yeah.
And he's talking about how Christians always focus on the bad and never the good, and the good is only a reward, and trying to make it into a nagger, like, they're just the naggers of God. So I don't know, it was weird.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he did raise some good questions by his essay, which was pretty nice.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That is interesting. Hello.
Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure my connection.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, it's
Just looking over
interesting
my notes.
stuff.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, it is interesting stuff. But I'm assuming, are you not a universalist? I'm assuming you're not a universalist.
Um, I'm a universalist leaning. I
Oh,
don't.
you're a
I'm not a
universalist.
full. I'm mostly an annihilationist,
Oh,
but
okay.
I lean universalism. I tend to take like eternal conscious torment as the eon like we're currently going in right now until um the second coming,
Right.
essentially. And then after that comes either annihilation or the refinement, like through the lake of fire. Either you're gonna all evil will be removed. You have any identity within that was ever an evil, and without knowing God, essentially, if you're dead without being alive in Christ, there's nothing to immortalize because there was no mortality to resurrect. And
Right.
I'd say that bases off of our evil and how much we stray from God. So
Yeah,
if there is no identity of good, there's can be nothing to resurrect.
that's
And
true.
with
Yeah.
and so I think it puts all three positions in a nice, neat little um, branch where they're all necessarily true, except for the universal salvation. But because it's not that all don't get saved; it's that evil um, is put to death. Like, and death is no more, so you can't have anything evil that would last because death's already done away with, and it's not going to be living forever.
Yeah. Well, I think St. Thomas would make the argument that when it comes to verses that say, people who are in hell are going to experience death, he would say that that's an idiom in the sense that the person who is in hell ultimately, has no hope anymore. I mean, they're ultimately stuck there, and there's no way of redemption. And he would say that death is kind of an idiom there because ultimately the hope that they have is no more. So they're spiritually dead in the sense that, there's no more hope for them. There's no more potential for them to ultimately be saved or participate in God's plan. I know that's one of the arguments he would make about that. Because, like, for example, when it says in the Bible, "Oh, whoever believes in me will live forever," obviously it's not talking about life on earth. Or if you read the Old Testament, where when it talks about the promised land, that's not actually talking about like the old.
Across the Jordan, right? Yeah.
Right, right, right. People, that was typology that was kind of understandable to the Israelites and the sojourners at that time. But a lot of that was just typology to kind of let people know, okay, this is what is being talked about. I know St. Thomas talks about it a lot in his view of analogy of being, which is basically this idea that God is so incomprehensible and is so beyond our natural knowledge, that certain analogies are given to him and his providence in the Bible so that we come to understand him better. So, for example, talk about he would talk about something uh, like I'll give you an example in Habakkuk chapter 1 verse 3, where when it says God's eyes are so pure, like it's not saying, oh yeah, God has little eyeballs and God is looking at you with those little eyeballs from heaven. um, what St. Thomas would say is because God is so incomprehensible, there are certain nouns that are placed onto him so that a person can kind of keep up and kind of understand who God is. And so I think what St. Thomas would say is because when he says when Jesus says things like, "Oh, whoever believes in me will never die," that's typology, because if Jesus were to explain truthfully, or not even truthfully, but if he was to explain, literally what heaven was, there's no means by which a person could even, understand in human words or human signs what he's saying, because it's a mystical reality that is so beyond us. So idioms are kind of given to sort of keep up with that.
Yeah, I would agree. I was gonna
Yeah.
point to what JG has, like, destroy not the body and soul. It really goes back to um like, we're all sentenced to death, right? Through
Yeah.
Adam and Eve's sin. So that's like the original sin that everyone speaks of. It's not that there's like some uh thing that makes us dirty. It's just that we're all placed under this decree of death, and we have to be made alive. And being made alive means coming through Christ. And if we're not made alive, there's no, after we die, what's there to immortalize? Because
Right.
you were never alive. You never
Right.
knew the Christ. And so I
Right.
think it speaks to this verse up here too as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't think, I think that there is a cutoff point that is our life, like, for hell. I don't think, like, um redemption can be found in hell. I just think it's just a euphemism for containment and confinement, or
Yeah. Well, I would
judgment.
disagree. Yeah, I would disagree that that redemption could be found in hell. I think, one of the things that Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange writes about is he writes about how mercy is ultimately how a person renders justice according to a person. So Saint Thomas and Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange and other Thomists talk about the nature of the virtues and what do the virtues mean. And the virtue of mercy, basically the idea is this is basically a means of how we facilitate justice. So for example, if a person on the street, let's say a person on the street is suffering and a person is poor and they're suffering and it's very clear they need help, ultimately, by you helping that person and choosing to help that person in need, you're facilitating your sense of justice by saying, okay, this person clearly needs help. I'm in a position where I can help this person. I'm more fortunate than this person. Therefore, I can help this person. Therefore, I'm going to render my sense of justice to a person who is more in need of it because they've been more deprived of that sense of justice. Whereas someone like, you know, someone like, Elon Musk, if you saw Elon Musk on the street, you probably wouldn't donate money to Elon Musk in the way you would donate money to a homeless person, because ultimately Elon Musk isn't in need of that type of money. The only reason you would pay Elon Musk is if there was a product you wanted to buy from him, but you wouldn't give him charity
Right.
because ultimately he's not in need of that level of charity. Therefore, your sense of mercy, your sense of
Right.
mercy would facilitate that. Okay, he's not in need of the same level of justice as this person who's scraping by on the streets. And
Can
so,
I interject for a second?
yeah, go ahead.
Do you think that alongside Elon Musk, and as a person who he is, that the justice that he does need may not be that of financial gain,
Oh, certainly,
but like that
absolutely.
of like wisdom, so like good counsel,
Oh, yes,
things like that, right?
absolutely. Absolutely, absolutely. I would agree with that. Obviously, I'm just talking about one area, but I would say the people who are billionaires and the people who I think choose to hog a certain amount of money, and that's ignoring. Obviously, that's not even factoring into account all the spiritual problems that Elon Musk has, to which I think there are many. But ignoring those, I mean, the idea of a person just owning everything and not voluntarily giving that up, I think a person like that, I think that person is definitely more in need of spiritual counsel, and in terms of mercy, that
Right.
person is
Yeah.
in need of mercy in that area. I mean, that's what Jesus says. Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for they will inherit heaven. He constantly makes this analogy between rich people who are poor in spirit and poor people who are rich in spirit. He constantly makes that analogy. And so I would absolutely apply that to Elon Musk. But yeah, in regards to mercy, and that kind of leads me to where I was getting to, when it comes to spiritual mercy and when it comes to people who are in hell, and I had this conversation with Jamie on his channel, and we actually agreed on this. Ultimately, the people who are in hell, both the people who have been reprobated to hell and the people who outside of that have ultimately also the demons and also Lucifer himself. The reason those people can't be redeemed, St. Thomas would say, is because God's mercy spiritually applies to those who, yes, have deliberately sinned, but may have sinned because of underlying factors. So, for example, we as humans, we were created with passions. And, there is a right usage of those passions, but there's also a deprivation of those passions as well. And there's also a misusage of those passions as well. So our passions are supposed to be rightly ordered towards the supreme good, which is God. But if we deprive ourselves of the supreme good, we can use those passions in ways that are contrary to the supreme good. For example, we can use those passions for lust, or we can use those passions for money or for other material goods. But because those material passions are so prominent, or those material goods are so prominent in the world, and because we are creatures that have passions, God takes mercy on the fact that ultimately it is very, very easy for us to misuse those passions. And also, he takes mercy on the fact that we, being descendants of Adam, are ultimately born into the situation where we've been deprived of original justice, and our souls are ultimately brought into the world deprived of God's favor because of the unjust situation that we didn't choose to be born into. And so because
Mhm.
of that, God takes mercy on our souls, and that's a rational area wherein we ultimately that's a rational area wherein we deliberately choose to sin, but there's ultimately underlying situations that cause us to ultimately lead to that situation. The reason that that's different from, say, the demons, who are separated from any way of being redeemed, is because the demons are fallen angels who were created very, very close to God, were created with everything they needed to be saved, and ultimately were created in a situation where they weren't deprived of any situation where they could seek
Right. Yeah.
grace. Therefore, there's no rational disposition to give them mercy. Now, the reason the reprobate go to hell is because ultimately, not only are they being punished, but ultimately they've been deprived. They've been given everything through the sacrifice of the cross. They've been given everything they possibly need to be saved. And so, if a person rejects Christ and rejects the love of God through the Spirit, after being given every single opportunity to ultimately be saved, then there remains no mercy left for the person, which is why they ultimately go to hell. That's why Jesus says blasphemy of the Son can be forgiven, but blasphemy of the Spirit cannot be forgiven. That's a verse in the Bible that, throws a lot of people for a loop. What St. Thomas says is ultimately the people who blaspheme the Spirit, they're not people that are like drawing a picture that makes fun of the Spirit, which is what people usually think of when they think of blasphemy against Christ. When people talk about blasphemy of the Spirit, they're people who are ultimately offered the love of God through the Spirit, like St. Paul says in the letter to the Romans. But because they've denied it their whole lives, ultimately there's no mercy left for them. And that's why that's the one sin that can't be forgiven.
Yeah, it just goes because it's literally saying the only thing that is good, because in itself it is the hatred of evil, is then loving evil, which is contradictory. Like even by the Spirit's nature, which is why it's such a it's desecration to God. It's like, how can you call the very good thing that is good omnibenevolence? To some would add on to the three other omnis, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And so there is no greater sin than that, to call the ultimate good evil and to twist that.
Precisely, yeah.
And which makes universalism somewhat dangerous.
Hey guys, I
Back
gotta
to the beginning.
I gotta roll out here, but you can stay on if you want. Did you have something?
I gotta get off too pretty soon. But I had a good conversation. That was a good conversation we had with you and Jamie and the other fellow. I didn't catch the other fellow's name, but that was a good conversation, and I appreciate the chat.
Yep.
Yeah, no problem. I was just gonna say, if you wanted to review that footage, were you trying to do that?
With Ace.
Yeah.
Maybe
you
when
can
it's
share
over.
your screen.
And no, maybe when it's over, I'm going to go downstairs and
Okay.
hang out with my youngin. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for coming in, guys. Take
All
care.
right. Yeah, of course.
Yep.
Of course.
God
Always
bless.
happy to have a good conversation.
Sir.